Beneath the cattle market of ancient Rome, in a chamber lined with cut stone, 4 living people were once led down into the dark, not soldiers captured on a battlefield, not criminals condemned by a court. A man and a woman from Gaul, a man and a woman from Greece, chosen for nothing they had done, only for who they were. The chamber was sealed above them while they still breathed, and the men who sealed it were the same men who, in every other surviving speech and history, insisted that Rome did not do such things. Rome burned no one alive to please its gods. Rome mocked the Druids of Gaul for exactly this kind of rite and called it savage, primitive, unworthy of a civilized people. And yet here, in the heart of the city, twice within a single human lifetime, the Romans did it themselves. Almost nothing marks the spot today. No inscription names the 4 who died there. No temple was raised over the chamber, no priesthood was founded to remember it, no anniversary was kept. The historians who mention it at all do so briefly, almost reluctantly, as though hurrying past something they would rather not explain. For a civilization that carved its victories into stone and recorded its scandals in exhaustive detail, this silence is strange. It raises a question that has followed the story for 2,000 years. If Rome truly believed this act was beneath it, why did the city perform it not once, but twice? And if the ritual meant so little, why did Rome spend the following centuries trying so hard to make sure the world forgot it happened at all? This is the story of that buried rite and of the empire that could not decide whether to confess it or erase it. But before we dive into this incredible story, subscribe to our channel, like this video, and if you can, support us with a gift. It helps motivate us to keep creating. To understand why 4 strangers ended up in a sealed pit beneath the Forum Boarium, Rome's ancient riverside cattle market, it helps to understand what the Romans actually believed a crisis required of them. Roman religion was not primarily a matter of private belief in the way many people today think of faith. It was a matter of correct practice. The Romans used a phrase for the condition they were always trying to maintain: the peace of the gods, an ongoing agreement in which the state performed the right rites, in the right order, at the right time, and the gods in turn kept disaster away from the city. When that peace seemed to break, when the world sent signs that something had gone wrong between Rome and its gods, the Senate did not turn to philosophy. It turned to specialists. Those signs were called prodigies, unusual or frightening events read as divine warnings, ranging from a lightning strike on a temple to reports of a 2-headed calf or a shower of stones falling from a clear sky. Local priests could interpret minor prodigies, but in moments of true emergency, the Senate reached for something older and stranger, a collection of Greek oracular verses known as the Sibylline books, said to have been purchased centuries earlier by an early Roman king from a prophetess called the Sibyl of Cumae. These books were kept under guard in the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill and consulted only when the Senate judged that ordinary religion was not enough. Consulting them was itself an admission of extremity, and the remedies they prescribed were rarely ordinary. They often called for something foreign, unfamiliar, even shocking, rites imported from outside the normal boundaries of Roman practice, because the crisis itself was understood to lie outside those boundaries too. Twice in the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Sibylline books were consulted amid a fear so specific and so old that it shaped the entire response. That fear had a name. A century earlier, in 390 BCE, a force of Gallic warriors had done what almost no enemy ever managed. They had taken Rome itself, sacking the city and holding it for months before withdrawing. The memory of that humiliation never fully faded. Generations later, the word Gaul alone could still summon dread in the Roman imagination, a symbol of chaos pouring down from the north, uncontrollable, ancient, and close. The first of the 2 crises came around 228 BCE, when reports reached Rome of a massive coalition of Gallic warriors, remembered as the Gaesatai, mustering for what looked like another invasion of Italy. Fear of a second sack of Rome spread through the city, and according to later writers, an old prophecy was recalled or newly interpreted, warning that Gauls and Greeks together would one day possess Roman soil. Whether this prophecy was ancient or freshly produced for the occasion, its effect was the same. The Senate turned to the Sibylline books, and the remedy they received was unlike anything in ordinary Roman worship. A man and a woman from Gaul and a man and a woman from Greece were to be buried alive within the city in the open ground of the Forum Boarium near the Tiber. The second crisis, and the one described in more surviving detail, came in 216 BCE after the Battle of Cannae, still remembered as one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. Hannibal's forces annihilated a Roman army so completely that tens of thousands of citizen soldiers died in a single day, along with a sitting consul and a striking portion of the Senate's own membership. Rome did not simply lose a battle. For a terrifying stretch of time, the city genuinely feared it might cease to exist. Into that panic came a second shock, this one religious rather than military. Two Vestal virgins, priestesses whose ritual purity was believed to be bound up with the safety of Rome itself, were found to have broken their vows of chastity. This was its own grave prodigy, handled through Rome's ancient and separate punishment for that specific offense, in which an unchaste Vestal was sealed alive in an underground chamber near the city gate, a punishment already old and already distinct from what would follow. But coming on top of the catastrophe at Cannae, the discovery convinced many Romans that the gods themselves had turned against the city. Once again, the Senate opened the Sibylline books. Once again, the answer pointed toward the same extraordinary remedy that had been used a dozen years earlier. A Gaulish man and woman, a Greek man and woman, were led down into a stone chamber beneath the Forum Boarium and buried alive, a rite the Roman historian Livy describes with visible unease, noting only that it was hardly in keeping with Roman custom, without lingering on the details of what the victims experienced. He does not dwell on their names, if he ever knew them. He does not describe their final words, because the sources give none. What survives is a handful of sentences, written decades or centuries after the event, by authors who seem to want the story finished as quickly as possible. That brevity is itself part of the mystery. Ancient historians were not typically shy about violence. Livy describes battles in exhaustive, almost loving detail, casualty counts, and troop movements stretching across long chapters. But when it comes to the burial in the Forum Boarium, the same historian who can spend pages on a single skirmish gives this rite only a passing, clipped mention, as though racing past a memory he would rather not develop. The Greek biographer Plutarch, writing later, adds a little more context about the earlier occurrence around 228 BCE, connecting it to the specific fear of the Geisatae invasion, but he too moves on quickly. No surviving Roman writer explains in his own voice why this particular remedy was chosen over any other, or what precisely it was meant to accomplish. The silence surrounding the ritual is almost as revealing as the ritual itself. What can be reconstructed, mostly from Livy and Plutarch, with real gaps that honest history has to admit rather than paper over, is this. The victims were foreigners, not Romans, chosen specifically because they belonged to the two peoples Rome feared most at that moment in its history: Gauls, whose armies had already humiliated the city once, and Greeks, whose culture, wealth, and recent wars in southern Italy made them a different but equally pressing anxiety. The rite took place not on the Capitoline, home to Rome's great state temples, but in the Forum Boarium, the riverside cattle market, a working commercial space on the edge of the city, associated in Roman legend with old stories of monsters, heroes, and boundary crossings, including the myth of Hercules defeating the fire-breathing Caecus near that very ground. The victims were not killed by blade or fire, and their blood was not offered on any altar to any named god. They were placed underground and left there, sealed inside earth and stone, a method utterly unlike a standard Roman animal sacrifice, in which the killing, the god receiving it, and the priest performing it were always clearly specified. That absence of a named recipient is one of the details modern historians of Roman religion return to again and again, because it makes the rite genuinely difficult to classify. A conventional Roman sacrifice was a transaction with a specific divine partner, conducted according to a known liturgy that priests could perform almost by memory. This was something else. No god is recorded as receiving the 4 lives taken in the Forum Boarium. No priesthood claimed the rite as part of its regular duties. It appears to have existed outside the normal architecture of Roman worship entirely, summoned only by the Sibylline books, performed once, apparently repeated once, and then, as far as the surviving record shows, never performed again in that form. Several interpretations have been proposed for what the Romans believed they were accomplishing, and honest history has to hold them as genuine possibilities rather than settled fact. One reading treats the rite as a form of what scholars sometimes call sympathetic magic, the idea that enacting a feared outcome in a small, controlled way could prevent the larger version from occurring. On this reading, the old prophecy warning that Gauls and Greeks would one day possess Roman ground was not defied so much as satisfied on Rome's own terms. By burying a Gaulish body and a Greek body within the city, the Senate could claim in a grim and literal sense that the prophecy had already come true, and in a form the Romans themselves controlled, foreclosing the far worse version in which living Gallic or Greek armies actually took the city. Another reading points to the irony that the Sibylline books, the very source of this remedy, were themselves of Greek origin, tied to the oracular tradition of Cumae, which raises the possibility that the ritual drew on non-Roman religious ideas about purification and the removal of pollution from a community, ideas closer to Greek scapegoat traditions than to native Roman practice. A third reading simply notes that in the depths of true panic, ancient states, like people, sometimes reached for the most extreme gesture available, regardless of whether it fit neatly into their normal worldview, because the scale of the fear demanded a gesture that felt equally enormous in return. None of these readings cancels the others out entirely, and modern historians continue to weigh them against one another rather than declaring a single verdict. What is not in genuine dispute is the contradiction the rite created for Rome's own self-image. Roman writers, particularly in the later Republic and into the age of the historian Julius Caesar, built a clear moral distinction between themselves and the peoples they were conquering. Caesar's own account of his campaigns in Gaul describes the Druids performing human sacrifice, presenting the practice as proof of Gallic barbarity, evidence that these were people who needed the civilizing hand of Rome. Roman writers made similar accusations against Carthage, condemning reports of child sacrifice to the god Baal-Hamon as a mark of that civilization's cruelty. The unspoken assumption running through all of this was that Rome itself did not do such things, that human sacrifice belonged to the world beyond Rome's borders, to peoples Rome considered less rational, less lawful, less civilized than itself. The burials in the Forum Boarium make that assumption impossible to sustain without qualification. Twice, in moments of true existential fear, the Roman state performed a rite that, whatever its precise theological logic, involved taking the lives of human beings chosen for their ethnicity and killing them through live entombment for religious purposes. The very practice Rome would later hold up as proof of others' savagery was, within living memory for many of the same senators making that argument, something Rome had done itself. Rome's own later relationship to human sacrifice underlines just how uncomfortable this history had become. The naturalist and encyclopedist Pliny the Elder records that in 97 BCE, a formal decree of the Senate outlawed human sacrifice within Roman territory, naming the consuls under whom it was passed. Pliny's brief mention is striking for what it implies rather than what it states outright, that the practice had continued in some form, close enough to living memory that an explicit law was needed to end it. A civilization does not typically need to ban, by name, a rite. It insists it has never practiced. The decree of 97 BCE reads less like the closing of a foreign chapter and more like Rome quietly settling accounts with its own past, drawing a legal line under something it preferred not to discuss in public again. After that point, the story of the Forum Boarium burials nearly vanishes from Roman literature. It survives at all, mainly because Livy and Plutarch, writing history rather than political rhetoric, felt bound to record it, even briefly, even reluctantly, as part of the honest chronicle of the war with Hannibal. Later Roman writers who wanted to celebrate Roman piety, Roman rationality, and Roman superiority over barbarian religion had every reason to leave the episode alone, and largely did. It survived not because Rome wanted it remembered, but because a small number of historians valued accuracy over comfort. The symbolism embedded in the choice of location deserves its own attention, because ancient audiences would have understood it in ways that can be easy to miss today. The Forum Boarium sat at the edge of the city proper, along the Tiber, a working market space where cattle were bought and sold, but also a threshold in the older sense, a place where the settled civic order of Rome met the river, the boundary, the world beyond. Roman myth already populated this ground with stories of danger tamed, most famously the tale of Hercules subduing the monstrous Cacus nearby. Placing the burial rite here, rather than on the Capitoline among the state's great temples, suggests the Romans themselves understood this act as belonging to the margins of their religious life, not its center, something necessary, but not to be mixed with the ordinary worship of Jupiter, Mars, or Vesta. It was handled at the edge of the city because, in some sense, it was an edge case of Roman religion itself, summoned only by the strangest of texts, for the strangest of threats. There is also a human cost to this story that is easy to lose beneath the theology and the historiography, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than glossed over. 4 people, a Gaulish man, a Gaulish woman, a Greek man, a Greek woman, in each of the 2 recorded instances, were killed not for any crime, not even as prisoners taken in the specific wars Rome was fighting at that moment, but simply because their ancestry matched the peoples named in a prophecy. Nothing in the surviving sources gives their names. Nothing records whether they were captives, residents of Rome, or people seized specifically for the purpose. Ancient historians focused on the religious and political meaning of the rite for Rome, treated the victims largely as symbols rather than as individuals, and that omission is itself a kind of second erasure, layered on top of the physical one. Responsible history has to acknowledge both losses, the lives taken, and the identities never recorded, without pretending to know details the sources simply do not provide. The legacy of this episode is not a legacy of monuments or festivals, because Rome built none. Its legacy is instead a case study, one of the clearest surviving windows into the gap between how the Romans wished to be seen and what the Roman state was willing to do under sufficient pressure. Modern historians of Roman religion return to the Forum Boarium burials precisely because they complicate the popular image of Rome as a coolly rational, legalistic civilization, an image the Romans themselves worked hard to project, especially by contrast with the peoples they conquered. The episode shows that image was, in part, a curated one, built and maintained partly through selective memory, and in this case, through something closer to willful forgetting. It shows that even a state famous for order, law, and precedent could, twice under the weight of genuine catastrophe, reach for a right it would later criminalize in its own laws and condemn in its enemies. There is a broader and more uncomfortable pattern here too, one that reaches beyond Rome specifically. Societies often define their own civilization in opposition to an imagined savagery located somewhere else, in some other people, some other era, some other belief system. The story of the buried Gauls and Greeks suggests how easily that boundary can blur, how a state can perform an act, quietly retire it, formally outlaw it, and then, within a generation or two, point to the very same act in a neighboring people as proof of that neighbor's inferiority, all without acknowledging the contradiction out loud. Rome was hardly unique in this pattern. It is simply unusually well documented, thanks to a pair of historians who chose honesty over convenience, even when the material made their own civilization look less enlightened than it wished to appear. Today, nothing remains to mark the spot in the Forum Boarium where that stone chamber once stood. Centuries of later construction, medieval churches, Renaissance streets, and modern Rome itself have long since buried the burial ground beneath layers the Romans themselves could never have imagined. There is no plaque, no ruin visitors can visit, no name carved anywhere to mark who died there or why. In a city that turned even minor triumphs into permanent stone inscriptions, that silence is its own kind of monument, more honest in its way than anything the Romans might have built on purpose. It tells us that Rome knew exactly what it had done, understood that the act sat uneasily beside everything it claimed to be, and chose, in the end, not to carve the memory into marble, but to let the earth quietly close over it instead. 2,000 years later, a handful of terse sentences in Livy and Plutarch are what kept that closed door from staying shut completely, a reminder that the empire which prided itself on remembering everything still, in the end, hoped that this was the one thing the world would forget.